The voice on the radio was steady, almost gentle, the kind of voice you trust without knowing why, and it belonged to a man that this same airport had once laughed out of its terminal. Gate 14 at Halloran Regional smelled of jet fuel and burnt coffee, and the rain came sideways across the apron in long silver sheets. 81 souls were strapped into a regional jet that had just been turned away from its first approach, and the woman at the gate desk, the one who had spent 11 years deciding who belonged on the secure side of the rope, stood very still as the speaker overhead crackled with the captain's name. She knew that name. She had written it once on a complaint form, a long time ago, when he was 9 years old and pressing his face against the glass. Before we get to what she remembered, before we get to the moment her hand went flat against the counter and stayed there, we have to go back. We have to go all the way back to a Tuesday in October, to a boy with a library book under his arm and a grandmother's voice in his ear. Because the story of how that plane came down safe did not begin on the radio. It began at a window nobody thought he had any business standing at. His name was Elias Bowen, and in the autumn he turned 9. The most expensive thing he owned was a paperback about weather. He lived with his grandmother in a narrow house 4 miles from the airport, close enough that the planes were a part of the sky the way clouds were, close enough that he had learned to tell a turboprop from a jet by sound alone before he could spell either word. His grandmother Verna cleaned offices at night and slept in the mornings, and between those 2 halves of her day she kept a kitchen so clean you could see the window in the countertop. She was a small woman with hands that had worked their whole lives, and she had raised Elias since he was 4, since the year his mother left and did not write. Verna believed in 3 things. She believed in being on time. She believed that a person should know the name of whatever they loved. And she believed, with a stubbornness that had outlasted 2 landlords and 1 flood, that the sky did not check anybody's pockets before it let them look up. That last one she said often, usually with her hand on the back of Elias's neck, steering him toward the bus or the bath or the table. The sky does not check your pockets, baby. It is the one free thing they have not figured out how to fence. Elias wanted to fly. Not the way children want things, here in the morning and gone by lunch. He wanted it the way Verna wanted the rent paid, steadily, every single day, as a fact of how he was built. He had a notebook with a cracked blue cover, and in it he copied the things he learned from library books. The names of clouds, the meaning of the windsock, the difference between lift and thrust. He drew runways with a ruler. He wrote down every plane he could identify and the time he saw it, and when the notebook filled, Verna bought him another from the dollar store and said nothing about the cost of it, which was its own kind of saying everything. There was a window at Halloran Regional, on the public side of the terminal, where the glass ran floor to ceiling and you could watch the planes push back and taxi and rise. It was not a secret place. It was where families waved at departing grandparents and where bored travellers killed an hour. For Elias it was church. He went on Saturdays. Verna would drop him on her way to a cleaning shift and collect him after. And in the 4 hours between he would stand at that glass with his notebook open and his face close enough to fog it, and he would watch men and women in white shirts with stripes on their shoulders walk out across the apron and climb into the machines he loved and lift them into the sky as if it were nothing, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world to do the impossible. Remember that window? We come back to it. The gate agent's name was Margaret Foss, and in those years she was newly promoted and proud of it, and she had a way of looking at the public side of the rope as if everything beyond it were already a little bit hers to manage. She wore her lanyard like a medal. She had decided somewhere in her first year that her job was not to help people through the airport, but to protect the airport from the people. And a small black boy who came every Saturday and stood too long at the glass had become, in her private accounting, a problem that had not yet happened. One Saturday in October it happened. Elias had brought a question with him. He had read, in a library book 3 weeks overdue and quietly renewed, about something called a go-around. The maneuver a pilot flies when a landing has to be abandoned at the last second, the throttle pushed forward, the nose lifted, the whole heavy weight of the thing, climbing back into the air it had just been ready to leave. He did not understand how a plane already committed to the ground could change its mind. He wanted to ask someone who knew. So when a pilot came through the public concourse that morning, hat under his arm, rolling a small black case, Elias stepped forward. He was polite. The Werner had drilled politeness into him the way other grandmothers drilled prayers. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Can you tell me how a go-around works?" The pilot stopped. He was an older man, tired from a red eye, and for a moment something flickered in his face that might have become kindness. He opened his mouth to answer. Margaret Foss got there first. She had crossed the concourse fast, her heels clicking, and she put herself between the boy and the pilot with the smooth authority of someone who had practiced it. "Sir," she said to the pilot, "you don't have to do that." And to Elias, in a voice pitched to carry, in a voice that several waiting passengers turned their heads to hear, she said the thing that he would not repeat to his grandmother that night, would not repeat for years, would carry folded up small in his chest the way you carry a stone you cannot put down. She told him this was not a playground. She told him people who actually had somewhere to be were trying to get there. She looked at his shoes, which were clean but cheap, and at his notebook, which was held together with tape, and she said, with a little laugh meant to invite the others to share it, that some children needed to learn the difference between dreaming and being in the way. "The pilots," she said, "the real ones, they don't come from windows, sweetheart. They come from schools you have never heard of." A few people laughed, not cruelly. Just the easy, thoughtless laugh of strangers relieved that an awkward moment had been handled by someone official. One man behind a newspaper chuckled without lowering it. A woman shushed her own child and gave Margaret a small, grateful nod, as if a danger had passed. Elias did not cry. "This is important, so I am going to say it plainly." He stood there with 81 heartbeats hammering in a 9-year-old chest, and his face went very still. And he closed his notebook with both hands so the tape would not catch, and he said, "Thank you anyway, to the pilot," who by then was already being moved along by the tide of his own schedule. Then Elias walked to the bench by the door and sat down and waited for his grandmother, and he did not let go of the notebook the entire time. The pilot never answered the question. Hold on to that too. A question asked and not answered does not disappear. It goes underground. It waits. Werner found him on the bench. She did not ask what was wrong because she could see what was wrong, and she had learned long ago that some hurts close up faster if you do not pour words on them. She took his hand. They walked out into the parking lot where the planes were going over, and she stopped, the way she did, and tilted her head back. "Look up," she said. He looked up. A jet was climbing out over the trees, gear still down, beautiful and impossible. "They did not let you ask your question," she said. It was not a guess. She knew the shape of that airport and the shape of her grandson, and she could read the distance between them. He nodded. She watched the jet a moment longer. Then she said the thing that became the floor he stood on for the next 10 years. She said, "Baby, listen to me. The sky does not know what they said to you in there. The sky was not in the building. When you are up there, the only thing that matters is whether you know what you are doing. Nobody can hand you that, and nobody can take it. So you go and you know more than them. You know so much that the knowing is the only word in the room." She reached into the pocket of her work coat and took out a small brass thing, round, scratched, the size of a pocket watch. It was an altimeter, an old aircraft instrument, the kind that tells a pilot how high they are above the sea. She had bought it years ago at an estate sale for $1 and kept it in a drawer. And she had been waiting, she said, for the right day to give it to him, and she had thought the right day would be a happy one. She put it in his hand. "This tells you how high you are," she said. "You keep it, and every time somebody on the ground tries to tell you you take it out, and you remember that the ground is not the only place a person can be measured from." He closed his fingers around it. The brass was warm from her pocket. He was 9 years old, and he had just been laughed out of a building, and he would later say, when he was a grown man and could say such things, that this was the moment his life actually started. Not the laughter, the altimeter, the hand that gave it to him. "Now let me take you forward, but slowly, because what happens in these years is the whole engine of the story. And if I rush it, you will not feel the weight of the radio voice when we get back to it. Elias did not become a pilot the easy way, because there was no easy way available to him. There was no money. There was no relative who flew, no family friend with a Cessna, no summer camp where children of a certain kind learned the controls of their inheritance. There was a grandmother who cleaned offices, a brass altimeter, a cracked notebook, and a library card. So he used the library card. He read everything Halloran's small branch had on aviation, and when he had read it all, the librarian, a quiet man named Mr. Okafor, who had noticed the boy who always returned books early, began ordering more through the county system. Elias read about aerodynamics and meteorology and the history of flight. He read the federal regulations, the actual ones aren't, the dense, grey pages most pilots only skim, and he understood them. And where he did not understand them, he read them again. He was building something. Nobody could see it yet. That is the nature of the thing being built. By 12, he knew more meteorology than most weekend pilots. By 14, he could recite the standard atmosphere and explain why an engine makes less power on a hot day. He kept a chart on his bedroom wall of every step it would take to sit in the left seat of an airline jet. And the chart was long and expensive, and most of it was impossible, and he did not take it down. In high school, he found the one door that money had not locked. The local community college ran an aviation program, and the program had, buried in its paperwork, a scholarship endowed decades earlier by a man who had wanted poor kids to fly. Almost nobody applied for it because almost nobody knew it existed. Elias knew it existed because Elias read paperwork the way other teenagers read screens. He applied. He wrote an essay that the scholarship committee would later describe as the cleanest statement of purpose they had read in years. He did not mention the window. He did not mention Margaret Foss. He wrote about an altimeter and a grandmother, and a question about go-arounds that had never been answered, and how he intended to spend his life answering it. He got the scholarship. It covered ground school and the first block of flight hours. Everything after that he paid for in the oldest way there is, by working. Here is a thing that does not photograph well, so the movies leave it out. Becoming a pilot from nothing is not a montage. It is years. It is fueling other people's planes at dawn for the discount on your own training. It is washing the belly of a crop duster for an hour of instruction. It is failing a check ride on a bad weather day and driving home in silence and going back the next week. It is eating cheaply, sleeping little, and watching classmates whose parents wrote checks move ahead of you while you save, for the next rating 1 fuel-pumping shift at a time. Verna saw most of it, not all of it because she died when Elias was 22, in the spring, between his commercial certificate and his first real flying job. She died the way she had lived, quietly and on time, in her own bed, with the kitchen clean. He was the one who found her. On the nightstand was a photograph of him at 9, standing at the airport window, taken from behind by a stranger who had mailed it to the house, years later with a kind note, and beside the photograph was a list in her handwriting of every rating he had earned, kept current, the way some people keep a ledger of a thing they are proud of and cannot say out loud. He flew her favourite hymn in his head on the drive to the funeral home. He did not cry until he was alone in the cockpit of a training plane 2 days. Later, doing a maintenance flight nobody required him to do, just to be in the air where she had told him. The sky did not know what they said to him in buildings. He climbed to 4,000 feet over the same trees the jets went over, and he took the brass altimeter out of his flight bag and set it on the glare shield where he could see it. And he let himself come apart for exactly as long as the flight lasted, and then he landed and was a professional again. Grief does not leave a person who flies. It just learns to ride along, strapped in, quiet. Now we are getting closer to the radio. Stay with me. The years did their work. Elias built ours the way he had built everything, slowly and without anyone handing him a thing. He flew freight in the dark in small twin-engine planes over country with no lights. He flew air ambulance, the hardest flying there is, in weather that grounded better-funded operations, because the people who needed the flight could not choose the weather. he instructed. He was, his chief pilots all said in nearly the same words, the most prepared aviator they had ever signed off. A man who briefed an approach as if his grandmother were grading it. At 28, he was hired by a regional airline. At 30, he upgraded captain, 4 stripes on each shoulder, the youngest in his class to do it, and the only one who had paid for every hour of it himself. The airline he flew for served small cities the big carriers had abandoned, and one of the cities on its map, because the world has a sense of symmetry that does not ask permission, was Halloran. The same Halloran. The same regional airport with the same floor-to-ceiling window on the public side, where on certain Saturdays, if you looked, you might still see a child with a notebook standing too close to the glass. Margaret Foss was still there. 11 years had not moved her. She had not been promoted again, because the smallness that makes a person guard a rope against a 9-year-old is the same smallness that keeps them at the rope forever. She was a senior gate agent now, which at a station that size meant she ran the gate on the busy afternoons, and she still wore her lanyard like a medal, and she still believed the airport was hers to protect from the people in it. She did not remember the boy. People like Margaret rarely remember the specific faces of the people they diminish. The diminishing is a habit, not an event. It does not file names. The airport remembered, though, or at least Mr. Okorafor did, the librarian, who had retired and taken a part-time job at the airport bookstore to be near the planes he had spent 30 years lending books about, and who had watched the departure boards one ordinary afternoon and seen a name he knew in the captain's slot of the inbound regional jet, and had stood there with his hand over his mouth. Here is the day. I want to give it to you the way it happened, hour by hour, because the timing is the whole thing. It was a Tuesday in October, the symmetry again. A line of weather was moving across the region faster than forecast, the kind of autumn system that turns a routine afternoon into a long one, with low clouds and rain and a crosswind that built through the afternoon like a fever. At 3:40 in the afternoon, Elias Bowen pushed back from a gate 2 states away with 81 passengers and 3 crew, bound for Halloran, with fuel for the trip and the legal reserves and the extra he always carried because his grandmother had believed in being early, and he had translated that belief into kilograms of jet fuel. He briefed his first officer, a young woman 6 months out of training named Priya Anand, with the calm thoroughness that made junior pilots want to fly with him. He told her the weather at Halloran was going down. He told her they would plan for an approach to minimums and a possible go-around, and he said the words go-around with no particular weight, because she could not know, nobody on that airplane could know, that the captain had been waiting 21 years to fly one over that particular field and have it mean what it was about to mean. At 4:15, the system reached Halloran ahead of them. Visibility dropped. The crosswind swung and gusted. The airport, never busy, emptied of its usual light traffic, as smaller planes diverted to fields with better weather. Inside the terminal, the arrivals board began to blink with delays, and the handful of people waiting for the inbound flight clustered near the window. Margaret Foss worked the gate. She announced the delay in her flat-carrying voice and told a nervous mother that these things happened and that the airline would sort it out, and she did not look up at the board often because the board was not her job. The rope was her job. At 4:40, Elias began the descent into Halloran. The clouds closed around the jet like wet wool. Rain streaked the windscreen. Priya read the checklist and her voice was tight, and Elias heard it, the way he heard everything, and he said, in the steady, gentle tone that was about to come over a speaker in a terminal, "You are doing fine. Just fly the numbers. I have got the radios." The first approach was clean and the field would not give it to them. At 200 feet above the ground, at the exact altitude where a pilot must see the runway or leave, there was nothing in the windscreen but grey and the silver chaos of rain, and the automated voice called minimums, and Elias Bowen did the thing a 9-year-old at a window had once asked a stranger to explain and never been told. He flew the go-around. He pushed the throttles forward smooth and full, and he raised the nose to the precise attitude he had recited from a library book at the age of 14, and the engines spooled up, and the heavy weight of the airplane stopped descending and began, against all the instinct that says a thing falling must continue to fall, to climb. He called for the gear up. Priya raised it. He called the missed approach and turned the airplane onto the published path with his hands as quiet as a surgeon's, and he climbed back into the cloud they had just descended through, and not one passenger spilled a drink. On the ground, the missed approach is a sound. The airport hears the engines surge. The people at the window, who had glimpsed the landing lights for one heartbeat through the murk, saw them lift and vanish back into the grey, and a small frightened murmur went through the gate. Margaret Foss picked up the desk phone to ask the ramp what was happening, and the ramp did not know, and the murmur grew. Elias keyed the cabin intercom. This is the part the gate would hear, because the airline's small terminal piped the captain's announcements to the public speakers when the jet bridge was connected for an arrival, a quirk of an old system nobody had updated. His voice came down out of the ceiling into the room with the window, into the air around the woman at the rope. "Folks," he said, "this is the captain. We came down for a look, and weather at Halloran is not quite ready to let us in yet. So we are going to go back up, take a lap, and give it another minute. There is nothing wrong with the airplane. This is a normal thing we train for. I have flown into this airport my whole life. I know this field. Sit back and let me do the worrying for you." "I know this field," he said it lightly. He said it for the 81 people behind him who needed to not be afraid. Mr. Okafor, though, standing in the doorway of the airport bookstore with his hand over his mouth, heard it land like a verdict, because he was the one person in the building who knew exactly which child had learned that field from the wrong side of a window. The weather lifted, as autumn systems do, in a seam. At 5:09, on the second approach, the grey tore open at 400 feet, and the runway was there, wet and shining and lined up exactly where Elias had told Priya it would be, and he flew the airplane down through the crosswind with small, steady inputs, crabbing into the gust, and straightening at the last instant, and he set the main wheels onto the centre line so gently that the touchdown was a question rather than an answer. The reversers roared. The airplane slowed. It turned off the runway and taxied in through the rain, and inside the terminal 81 families worth of waiting people began, without quite knowing why, to clap. Margaret Foss did not clap. Margaret Foss was looking at the inbound crew sheet that the ramp had finally sent up to the gate printer, because part of her job was to know which crew was arriving, and on the sheet was the captain's name, printed plainly, the way names are printed when they have stopped being a thing anyone is allowed to laugh at. Bowen, Elias. She knew it. She did not know from where, not at first. It sat in her like a key in the wrong pocket, and the jet bridge mated to the airplane, and the door opened, and the passengers came up the bridge full of the loud relief of people who had been a little afraid and were now safe, and behind them, after the cabin had emptied the way captains let it empty, came the crew, the young first officer first, then the captain, hat on, 4 stripes catching the terminal light, a small black flight case rolling behind him, and a worn flight bag over his shoulder. He was a grown man, tall, calm, unhurried. Margaret Foss, though, had spent her whole career studying the faces of people on the public side of the rope, and somewhere under the captain's hat she found the face of the boy she had moved along with a laugh 11 years before, and her hand went flat against the counter and stayed there. He saw her. Of course he saw her. He had seen her the moment the crew sheet told him which station he was flying into, weeks ago when the schedule came out, and he had flown the whole trip knowing she might be at that gate, and he had decided somewhere over the dark country between then and now exactly what he was and was not going to do about it. He did not do what the movies would have him do. He did not stop in front of her and make a speech. He did not lower his voice and remind her of a Saturday in October. His grandmother had pressed into him was not the kind that needed a witness to be real. He walked toward the gate, and as he passed the desk where Margaret Foss stood with her hand flat on the counter and her face, working through a recognition she could not place, he slowed, just slightly, and he said one thing. He said, "The weather is supposed to clear by morning. Have a good night." That was all. It was not a weapon. It was the opposite of a weapon. It was the voice that had come down out of the ceiling and told 81 frightened strangers to let him do the worrying, turn now on the one person in the building who had earned a reckoning and was given grace instead. And it undid her more completely than any speech could have. Because there is no defence against being treated well by someone you were cruel to. Before they were anyone at all, Mr. Okafor reached him at the top of the jet bridge. The old librarian's eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it. He put out his hand and Elias took it, and the old man said, "I ordered those books. Through the county system. I do not know if you remember." And Elias said, in a voice that was not steady anymore, "I remember every one of them, Mr. Okafor." And the two of them stood there a moment in the rain-loud terminal. The boy who had asked, and the man who had answered with a library. And that, more than anything that happened at the gate desk, was the real reunion now. The story could end there, and many would let it. This niche, this kind of story, knows that the stone is less important than the ripple. And the ripple is where the justice actually lives. So stay a little longer. The clapping passengers did a thing passengers sometimes do. One of them, a man who had spent the go-around gripping the armrest and praying, had also spent it filming the window, the way frightened people film things, and he had caught the landing lights lifting back into the cloud, and the second approach breaking through, and the gentle touchdown. And he had caught, on the audio, the captain's announcement coming down from the ceiling. "I have flown into this airport my whole life." He posted it that night with a few words about the calmest pilot he had ever flown with. It would have stayed small. Most things do. Mr. Okafor, though who had spent a career connecting people to the stories that belonged to them, made one phone call to a reporter he knew at the regional paper, and he told her there was more to the man in the video than a steady voice. And he told her that about a window and a notebook, and a scholarship almost nobody applied for, and the reporter, who was good at her job, found Elias on a layover and asked him if it was true. He told her the truth, but he told it his way. He did not name Margaret Foss. When the reporter, who had done her homework and found the 11-year-old complaint form in the airport's own records, asked him directly whether a gate agent had once humiliated him at that very window, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing that ran in the paper, and then ran much further than the paper. He said, "Somebody laughing at a child does not get to be the most important part of that child's life. My grandmother gets to be the most important part, so I would rather talk about her." And he talked about Werner. He talked about the altimeter which he showed the reporter, brass and scratched and still in his flight bag after all these years, and about the sky not checking your pockets, and about a woman who cleaned offices and kept a ledger of her grandson's ratings on her nightstand. The story that ran was not a revenge story. It was a love story about a grandmother, and it was read by hundreds of thousands of people. And somewhere in the reading, the small woman who had died quietly and on time became briefly immortal. The airline read it too. Now here is where the consequence comes, and it comes the way real consequence comes in these stories. Not as a scene, but as a structure, not as a shout, but as a quiet rearrangement of who stands where. The airline did not fire Margaret Foss. That is not how this works. And the story does not pretend otherwise, because a firing would have made her a victim and let her off the hook of having to live inside what she had done. What the airline did was simpler and heavier. They had read the story, and the story had embarrassed a company that flew on the goodwill of the small cities it served. And so the company decided to do something visible and good at Halloran. And what they decided to do was fund a program. They created an aviation scholarship and an after-school flight science club for local kids. And they housed it, of all the places in the airport they could have housed it, in a glassed-in room on the public concourse. The room with the floor-to-ceiling window. The window. They put desks in it and donated a flight simulator and a wall of books, and they needed someone to staff the desk at the entrance, to check the children in, to make sure they belonged. They gave that desk to Margaret Foss. Sit with that. The woman whose entire authority had been the power to decide which children were allowed to stand at that window was now the woman who's welcomed them through it. Every Saturday, children who looked like the boy she had laughed at came to the window she had once guarded against him, and she checked them in, and she handed them visitor badges, and she watched them press their faces to the glass she had once pulled a child away from. She did not get to laugh anymore. The smallness that had been her power was now very precisely her assignment, and there is no consequence more exact than being made to spend your days doing the opposite of your cruelty. The airline named the scholarship. They asked Elias what to name it, since the story had made it possible, and he did not name it after himself. He named it after Werner Bowen. There is a brass plaque by the door of the glass room now, and a child's hand reaches up to touch it on the way, in the way you touch a thing for luck. And the plaque does not say what the airport did wrong. It only says her name, and underneath it, the one line of hers he chose to carve into a public building. The sky does not check your pockets. Elias came back to Halloran often after that, because his airline kept the route and he kept bidding it. On his layovers he would walk down to the glass room, still in uniform, 4 stripes on his shoulders, and he would answer the children's questions. He answered all of them. He answered the easy ones and the impossible ones, and he never once moved a child along, never once told a single one of them that pilots came from schools they had never heard of. When they asked him how a go-around worked, and they always eventually asked, because children who love the sky are drawn to the maneuver that defies it, he would crouch down to their height, and he would take a scratched brass altimeter out of his flight bag, and he would explain it slowly, completely, the way a stranger should have explained it to him a long time ago. Priya Anand made captain 3 years later, and the first thing she did was bid the Halloran route, because she had flown that go-around in the right seat and had understood, watching her captain's quiet hands, that she had been in the presence of something she wanted to become. The witness becomes the next link. That is also how this works. And Margaret Foss. The story owes you one more honest look at her, because cheap stories make the antagonist disappear, and true ones make her stay. She did not have a great awakening. People rarely do. Something in her loosened, though slowly, over the seasons of checking those children in, and one Saturday, years into the assignment that had been a punishment, a small girl with a taped-together notebook asked her, shyly, whether girls could be pilots too, and Margaret Foss, who had spent her whole life deciding who belonged, looked at the child for a long moment, and then she said yes. She said, yes, you can. She said it quietly, and she meant it, and it was not redemption, because redemption is too large a word for one true sentence. It was the sky, though, for 1 second, declining to check a child's pockets, said by the last person you would have expected to say it, in the room where she had once said the opposite. So let me come back to where we started, to the radio, to the steady gentle voice that this airport had once laughed out of its terminal. Because now you know whose voice it was, and now you know why the woman at the gate desk put her hand flat against the counter and could not lift it. Here is what I want you to take from this, and I am going to say it to you directly. The way Werner said things to Elias. Plainly and with my hand on the back of your neck. Somewhere right now there is a child standing too close to a window. They are looking at something they have been told, in 100 small ways, is not for people like. Maybe somebody has already laughed. Maybe the laugh is still folded up small in their chest like a stone they cannot put down. And the people doing the laughing are so sure, so comfortable in the certainty that they are the gatekeepers and the child is just in the way. The gate is not the sky. The rope is not the sky. The lanyard worn like a medal is not the sky. The people who guard the door have confused the door with the destination, and they have made the oldest mistake there is, which is to believe that because they get to decide who stands at the window, they also get to decide who flies. They do not. Nobody does. The only thing that decides whether you fly is whether you know what you are doing when the weather closes in and the ground disappears and the automated voice calls minimums, and you have to choose in 1 second, with 81 lives behind you, whether to fall or to climb. So go and know more than them. Know so much that the knowing is the only word in the room. Carry whatever your grandmother gave you, the altimeter or the hymn or the one sentence that holds you up, and keep it where you can see it when the people on the ground try to tell you how low you are. And the next time you pass a child at a window, do not move them along. Crouch down to their height. Answer the question. You never know whose plane you will someday be a passenger on. Trusting a voice on the radio you have no reason to trust except that it is steady and it is sure, and you never know that the steadiness in that voice was built, year by quiet year, by a child you could have laughed at, or a child you could have answered. Answer them. If this story put a hand on the back of your neck the way it was meant to, sit with it tonight, and then tell me about the windows you were once kept from, and the voice that told you to look up anyway. I would like to know whose name belongs on your plaque.